The early morning sunlight streamed through the slightly dusty kitchen window of the Thompsons' small apartment, casting warm patterns on the worn but clean linoleum floor. 8-year-old Sarah Thompson stood on her tiptoes, her bright yellow pajamas still on, watching intently as her mother, Jenny, moved around their modest kitchen with practiced grace. The familiar scent of fresh coffee filled the air as Jenny, still in her nursing scrubs from her night shift, carefully spread creamy peanut butter on fresh white bread. Her movements were slow and deliberate, despite her obvious exhaustion. Sarah loved these quiet morning moments with her mother, especially watching her prepare her favorite lunch, a peanut butter and honey sandwich. "Mom, can you make the honey drizzle into a smiley face today?" Sarah asked, her big brown eyes twinkling with hope. Jenny smiled, the tired lines around her eyes softening as she looked at her daughter. Even after a 12-hour shift at the local hospital, she never rushed this special morning ritual. "Of course, sweetie," Jenny replied, carefully drawing a golden smile with the honey. Their kitchen might not have been the fanciest. The cabinets needed a fresh coat of paint, and some of the drawer handles were loose, but it was filled with love and the sweet aroma of their daily routine. Sarah watched as her mother's hands, gentle despite their roughness from constant washing at the hospital, wrapped the sandwich carefully in wax paper before placing it in her worn but beloved Winnie the Pooh lunchbox. Times were tough for their little family of 2, but Jenny always made sure Sarah's lunch was packed with care and love. "Remember what we always say about our sandwiches?" Jenny asked, tucking a small note beside the carefully wrapped lunch. It was their special tradition, one that started when Sarah first began school 2 years ago. That they're made with love and gratitude. Sarah chirped, reciting their daily motto with enthusiasm. She might have been young, but she understood more than most children her age. She noticed how her mother checked prices carefully at the grocery store, and how she mended Sarah's clothes instead of buying new ones. As Jenny packed a small apple and a handful of pretzels into the lunchbox, she shared their daily morning lesson. "You know, Sarah, we might not have everything that some people have, but we have enough to share. And having enough to share makes us rich in the ways that really matter." Sarah nodded solemnly, her small fingers tracing the worn edges of her lunchbox. She watched as her mother tucked in a small paper napkin with a hand-drawn heart, just like she did every morning. Even though Jenny was tired from her night shift, she never skipped these little touches that made Sarah feel special. The morning light grew stronger, creating a cozy glow in their small kitchen. The old clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking another precious morning moment between mother and daughter. Jenny helped Sarah with her backpack, its straps carefully adjusted and patched where needed. "Today's going to be a special day," Jenny said, smoothing Sarah's hair and straightening her simple blue uniform. "I can feel it." She didn't know just how right she was, or how her daughter's packed lunch would set in motion events that would change not just their lives, but their entire community. Sarah hugged her mother tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of hospital soap and coffee that always clung to Jenny's scrubs. In that moment, their small kitchen felt like the warmest, safest place in the world. Neither of them could have guessed that this ordinary morning, with its simple ritual of making a peanut butter and honey sandwich, would lead to an extraordinary chain of events that would touch numerous lives. The afternoon sun painted long shadows across the sidewalk as Sarah made her way home from school. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the sweet scent of fallen leaves that crunched pleasantly under her worn shoes. She had taken her usual route through Henderson Park, a small green space that served as a shortcut between her school and home. Today had been a good day. She'd earned a gold star on her math quiz, and during art class, she painted a picture of her mother that her teacher said showed real talent. The painting was rolled carefully in her backpack, protected by a rubber band, and she couldn't wait to show it to her mom when she woke up from her day rest after her night shift. As Sarah skipped along the familiar path, something different caught her attention. On the park's old wooden bench, the one where elderly Mr. Roberts usually fed pigeons, sat a man she had never seen before. He wasn't like the other adults who sometimes stopped to rest there. His clothes, though clean, were wrinkled and worn, with small tears that reminded Sarah of how her mother carefully mended her own clothes when they couldn't afford new ones. The man's shoulders were slumped, and his gaze was fixed on the ground, seemingly lost in thought. His gray beard was neatly trimmed, but his eyes held a weariness that made Sarah slow her steps. She noticed how other people walked past him, some quickening their pace, others deliberately looking away. A mother even pulled her young son to the other side of the path. But Sarah saw something else. In the man's eyes, she recognized a familiar sadness, the same look she sometimes caught in her mother's expression when she thought Sarah wasn't watching. It was the look her mom got when bills arrived in their mailbox, or when Sarah's shoes had holes, but it wasn't quite payday yet. The man's hands were clasped tightly in his lap, and Sarah noticed they were clean but rough, like they had done a lot of work in their time. A small silver ring glinted on his finger, partially hidden by how he wrung his hands together. Despite his disheveled appearance, there was something dignified about the way he sat, like someone who was used to sitting up straight, but had forgotten how to do it anymore. Unlike the rushing adults around her, Sarah didn't feel scared. Instead, she felt curious and a little sad. She remembered her mother's words from that morning about having enough to share, and how that made them rich in ways that really mattered. The man hadn't moved or looked up, but something about him made Sarah think he might not have eaten lunch today. Her Winnie the Pooh lunchbox suddenly felt heavy in her backpack. She hadn't eaten her sandwich during lunch because Jessica had shared her birthday cupcakes with the class, and Sarah had been too excited about the special treat to eat anything else. The peanut butter and honey sandwich, made with such care that morning, was still perfectly wrapped in its wax paper, waiting to be enjoyed. As the autumn breeze rustled through the nearly bare trees, Sarah made a decision. Her mother had always taught her to be careful with strangers, but she had also taught her about kindness and helping others. Standing there on the leaf-covered path, watching the lonely figure on the bench, Sarah felt in her heart that this was one of those moments her mother talked about, when doing the right thing was more important than being afraid. What Sarah didn't realize, as she gathered her courage to approach the bench, was that this simple moment would set in motion events that would change not only her life, but the lives of many others in ways she couldn't imagine. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of kindness, and on this ordinary autumn afternoon, something extraordinary was about to begin. With small, determined steps, Sarah approached the bench, her heart beating a little faster with each step. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind about being careful with strangers, but something in her heart told her this was different. The fallen leaves crunched softly under her feet, announcing her presence before she even spoke. The man looked up slowly as Sarah came closer, surprise flickering across his tired face. His eyes, a gentle shade of blue, held a mix of confusion and warmth that made Sarah feel less nervous. Up close, she could see that despite his worn clothes, he carried himself with a certain dignity, like her grandfather had before he passed away last year. "Hello," Sarah said softly, clutching the strap of her backpack. "Would you like my sandwich?" She began unzipping her lunchbox, the familiar sound breaking the quiet afternoon air. The man blinked several times, as if trying to make sure she was real. "Aye, that's very kind of you, little miss," he replied, his voice surprisingly gentle and well-spoken. "But I couldn't take your lunch." His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, and Sarah noticed a small police academy pin on his jacket, partially hidden under a fold of fabric. "It's okay," Sarah insisted, already pulling out the carefully wrapped sandwich. "My name is Sarah, and my mom made it this morning. It's peanut butter and honey." She held it out, the wax paper crinkling invitingly. "Mom says we always have enough to share, and sharing makes us rich in the ways that matter." The man's eyes grew misty at her words. "I'm Michael," he said quietly, his voice catching slightly. "Michael Cooper. And your mother sounds like a very wise woman." He hesitated, then asked, "Are you sure about this, Sarah?" Sarah nodded firmly, placing the sandwich on the bench between them. "Mom made the honey into a smiley face," she explained, as if this made the sandwich even more special. "Sometimes when I'm sad, Smiley faces helped make things better. Michael carefully picked up the sandwich, his hand still trembling. As he unwrapped it, a small note fell out, the one Jenny had tucked in that morning. Sarah quickly picked it up and read it aloud. "Remember to share your smile. It might be the light someone needs today." Tears welled up in Michael's eyes as he heard these words. He held the sandwich as if it were made of gold, staring at the careful way it had been cut into triangles. "You know, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "sometimes angels come in small packages." Sarah smiled brightly, pleased that he seemed to appreciate her mother's sandwich-making skills. "Would you like to know a secret?" she asked, settling onto the far end of the bench. "Mom says every sandwich she makes has a special ingredient: love. That makes them extra good." As Michael took a small, grateful bite, Sarah noticed how he savored it, like it was the most precious meal he'd had in a long time. A few passers-by slowed their steps, watching the unusual scene of a little girl in a school uniform sharing her lunch with a homeless man. "Thank you, Sarah," Michael said after finishing half the sandwich. He carefully wrapped the remaining portion, his hand steadier now. "You remind me of someone I used to know, someone who always saw the good in people." Sarah beamed at the compliment, swinging her legs that didn't quite reach the ground. She didn't understand the full impact of her simple act of kindness, or how it would soon set wheels in motion that would change many lives. She just knew that the sad look in Michael's eyes had softened a bit, and that made her happy. The autumn sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park. "I should go home now," Sarah said, standing up and adjusting her backpack. "Mom will be waiting." She gave Michael one last smile, as bright as the honey face in the sandwich. As she turned to leave, Michael called out softly, "Sarah." She looked back. "God bless you, little one." His voice carried years of untold stories and renewed hope, though Sarah was too young to understand the depth of emotion behind his words. Behind the simple kindness of a shared sandwich lay a story that young Sarah couldn't have imagined. Michael Cooper wasn't always the man sitting alone on that park bench. Just 1 year ago, he had worn the proud uniform of the city's police department, badge number 2476 gleaming on his chest, earning commendations for his dedicated service to the community. In his office at the precinct, a wall of photographs had told the story of his 20-year career. Pictures of Michael at his graduation from the police academy, snapshots of him helping at community events, and medals for bravery pinned carefully beside them. But the most precious photo had been of his wife, Emma, her warm smile brightening even the longest days on duty. Emma had been a teacher at the local elementary school, beloved by her students for her gentle nature and endless patience. She and Michael had met when he gave a safety presentation to her class 15 years ago. Their love story had been the kind that made others believe in fate, the tough police officer and the kind-hearted teacher who balanced each other perfectly. Life had been good, filled with simple joys and shared dreams, until the day Emma started feeling unwell. What began as occasional headaches quickly turned into something more serious. The doctors' faces grew grimmer with each visit, and words like aggressive and terminal began to fill their conversations. Despite having health insurance, the experimental treatments they desperately tried weren't covered, forcing them to dig deep into their savings and take out loans. Michael had spent every moment he could at Emma's bedside, reading her favorite books aloud and telling her stories about his day at work. He would bring her fresh flowers every week, just as he had done since they first started dating. Even as she grew weaker, Emma never lost her smile or her concern for others. "Promise me you'll keep helping people," she had whispered one quiet evening. "That's what makes life worth living." But 6 months ago, after a brave battle, Emma had slipped away quietly in her sleep, leaving Michael alone in their home filled with memories. The medical bills had piled up, mounting into an insurmountable wall of debt. Grief-stricken and overwhelmed, Michael had missed more and more days at work. His colleagues had tried to help, but he had pushed them away, lost in his sorrow. Eventually, unable to keep up with the payments, he had lost their small house. His proud spirit couldn't bear to accept help from his fellow officers, so one day, he simply hadn't shown up for his shift. He left his badge on his desk with a short note. "I'm sorry. I can't do this anymore." The precinct had searched for him, but Michael had disappeared into the streets of the city he once protected. He carried only a few precious belongings: his wedding ring, a small photo of Emma, and the police academy pin he couldn't bear to part with. His former colleagues had posted missing person flyers, worried about their friend who had given so much to others but couldn't ask for help himself. Now, sitting on the park bench with half of Sarah's sandwich carefully wrapped beside him, Michael felt something he hadn't experienced in months: a small spark of hope. The little girl's simple act of kindness, her innocent words about sharing and her mother's note about smiles being light in darkness, had touched something deep in his heart. It reminded him of Emma's last words about helping others and the joy they had found in serving their community. What Michael didn't know was that his chance encounter with Sarah would soon lead him back to the family he had left behind at the precinct. Sometimes it takes the pure heart of a child to remind us that even in our darkest moments, we're never truly alone. Mrs. Rose Chen had owned the corner bloom flower shop facing Henderson Park for over 20 years. From behind her counter filled with colorful bouquets, she had witnessed countless stories unfold in the park across the street. But none had touched her heart quite like the scene she watched that autumn afternoon. Through her shop window, decorated with seasonal mums and pumpkins, she had noticed the man on the bench hours ago. She had seen how people avoided him, creating a bubble of loneliness around his hunched figure. Something about him seemed familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. Then she saw the little girl in the blue school uniform approach him. At first, Mrs. Chen's hand had instinctively moved toward her phone, ready to call for help if needed. But as she watched the scene unfold, her concern turned to amazement. The girl's innocent kindness, the careful way she shared her sandwich, and the man's gentle response made Mrs. Chen pause her afternoon flower arranging to watch more closely. As she observed their interaction, something clicked in her memory. The missing person posters, the ones the police had been putting up around the neighborhood for months. She quickly walked to her bulletin board, where community notices hung among delivery schedules and business cards. There, partially hidden behind a newer flyer for a local bake sale, was the poster she remembered. Her hands trembling slightly, Mrs. Chen carefully unpinned the paper. The photograph showed a clean-shaven man in a police uniform, standing proud and tall. Though the man on the bench looked different now, his eyes were the same. The poster identified him as Officer Michael Cooper, missing for 6 months, last seen leaving the Central Precinct. There was a note about him possibly being in an emotionally fragile state after losing his wife. Mrs. Chen looked back through her window. The girl was leaving now, her backpack bouncing slightly as she walked away. The man, Officer Cooper, sat there holding half a sandwich, looking after her with tears in his eyes. Mrs. Chen remembered how he used to come into her shop every week to buy flowers, always with a kind word and a friendly smile. She had even provided flowers for his wife's classroom during special events. Taking a deep breath, she picked up her phone and dialed the number on the poster. "Hello. Yes, I'm calling about Officer Michael Cooper," she said softly, still watching through the window. "I found him, and you might want to hear about the little angel who just helped him." As she spoke with the police, Mrs. Chen described everything she had witnessed. She told them about the girl's school uniform, thinking it might help identify her. She explained how the child had shown such natural kindness, sharing her lunch and sitting with someone everyone else had avoided. It was like watching a miracle, Mrs. Chen told the officer on the phone, wiping away a tear of her own. That little girl did what none of us grown-ups were brave enough to do. She saw past his appearance to the person underneath. After hanging up, Mrs. Chen gathered a small bouquet of yellow daisies, flowers that symbolize new beginnings. She stepped out of her shop, walking toward the bench where Michael still sat. He looked up as her shadow fell across him, recognition slowly dawning in his eyes. "Welcome back, Officer Cooper," she said gently, holding out the flowers. "We've all missed you very much." Her voice carried the warmth of their old friendship, showing him that not all connections were lost. What Mrs. Chen didn't know was that her phone call would set in motion a series of events that would not only help Michael find his way back to his police family, but also bring unexpected joy to the little girl who had shown such compassion. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create ripples that touch more lives than we could ever imagine. The early morning light was just beginning to peek through the kitchen curtains when Jenny Thompson heard the knock at their door. She had just returned from her night shift at the hospital, still in her blue scrubs, and was preparing to make Sarah's lunch for the day. The sound made her pause, a slice of bread still in her hand. Sarah was at the kitchen table, happily coloring in her school notebook. She looked up at the unexpected sound, her eyes meeting her mother's with curiosity. They rarely had visitors, especially this early in the morning. Another gentle knock echoed through their small apartment. Jenny's heart began to beat a little faster. Early morning knocks usually meant either bad news or bill collectors. She wiped her hands on a kitchen towel and walked to the door, trying to keep her growing anxiety from showing on her face. Through the peephole, she saw two police officers standing in the hallway. They were both in full uniform, their badges catching the fluorescent hallway light. Jenny's throat tightened. Had something happened? Was someone hurt? Her mind raced through possibilities as she opened the door with slightly trembling hands. "Mrs. Thompson," the female officer asked kindly. Her nameplate read Officer Martinez, and her smile was gentle and reassuring. Beside her stood a taller officer whose badge identified him as Officer Chen. "Yes, that's me," Jenny replied, unconsciously stepping slightly in front of the doorway, a mother's protective instinct kicking in. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, ma'am," Officer Chen quickly assured her, noting her worried expression. "We're actually here about something wonderful your daughter did yesterday." Jenny's eyebrows rose in surprise. Behind her, she heard Sarah's small footsteps approaching. "Mommy, who is it?" The officers' faces brightened at the sight of Sarah in her yellow pajamas, her dark hair still messy from sleep. Officer Martinez knelt down to Sarah's eye level, her smile warming even more. "Are you the little angel who shared your sandwich in Henderson Park yesterday?" she asked softly. Sarah nodded, suddenly shy. "It was a peanut butter and honey sandwich," she explained quietly. "Mom made it special," with a smiley face. Jenny looked between her daughter and the officers, confusion clear on her tired face. "I don't understand. Is sharing a sandwich some kind of problem?" Officer Chen shook his head, his eyes twinkling. "Quite the opposite, Mrs. Thompson. Your daughter's sandwich, and more importantly her kindness, helped us find someone very special who has been missing for 6 months." As the officers explained about Michael Cooper, his story, and how Sarah's simple act of compassion had led to his discovery, Jenny sank into their worn living room couch, overwhelmed by the news. Tears welled in her eyes as she learned how her daughter's small gesture had sparked hope in a man who had lost everything. "The entire precinct has been searching for Officer Cooper since he disappeared," Officer Martinez explained, her voice thick with emotion. "We've been so worried about him. And it was your daughter's kindness that finally reached him when nothing else could." Sarah climbed onto the couch next to her mother, not fully understanding why everyone seemed so emotional. "I just shared my sandwich, Mommy," she said simply. "Like you always teach me to share." Jenny pulled her daughter close, kissing the top of her head. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, "you did so much more than that. You showed that love and kindness can change lives." The morning sun was now fully streaming through their windows, filling their small living room with warm light. Officer Chen reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "The precinct would like to do something special for Sarah," he said, "to thank her for helping us find our friend. And Mrs. Thompson," he added, looking at Jenny with respect, "thank you for raising such a compassionate daughter. Our world needs more people like Sarah." What had started as a moment of fear at an early morning knock had transformed into something beautiful. None of them knew it yet, But this was just the beginning of how Sarah's simple act of kindness would continue to touch and change lives. News travels fast in small communities, and the story of Sarah's kindness spread like wildfire through the town. It started with Mrs. Chen from the flower shop, telling her regular customers about what she had witnessed. Then Officer Martinez shared the story during her morning coffee stop at the local diner, bringing tears to the eyes of both the waitress and the regulars at the counter. By the next afternoon, the local newspaper had picked up the story. The headline read, "8-year-old's sandwich saves former officer," with a photo of Sarah in her school uniform, standing proudly next to Officers Martinez and Chen. The article told of how a child's simple act of sharing had helped find a missing police officer who had disappeared after losing his wife. At the police station, Captain Rodriguez sat at his desk, reading the article for the third time. He remembered Michael Cooper as one of his best officers, always first to volunteer for community outreach programs, never missing a chance to help others. The captain's eyes lingered on the part about Michael's mounting medical bills from his wife's treatment. "We have to do something," he announced to the gathered officers in the morning briefing. "Not just for Michael, but for the little girl and her mother too. This is what being the community means." The response was immediate and heartfelt. Officer Chen suggested organizing a fundraiser. Officer Martinez mentioned that her sister worked at the local community center and could help secure a venue. Another officer remembered that his brother owned a popular restaurant downtown and would probably donate food for the event. The idea snowballed quickly. Mrs. Chen offered to provide flowers for decorations. The owner of the diner promised to bake her famous desserts. The local grocery store pledged to match whatever funds they raised. Even Sarah's school got involved, with her teacher, Ms. Andrews, organizing the students to make thank you cards for all the donors. Jenny Thompson was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. When Captain Rodriguez visited their apartment to discuss the fundraiser, she tried to refuse, saying they couldn't accept such generosity. But the captain gently explained, "Mrs. Thompson, your daughter reminded us all of what community really means. Please let us show her that when one person shares their kindness, others want to share too." The fundraiser was scheduled for the following Saturday at the community center. The usually plain gymnasium was transformed with streamers, balloons, and Mrs. Chen's beautiful flower arrangements. Tables lined the walls, filled with home-cooked dishes brought by police officers' families and local restaurants. A large banner hung above the stage reading, "Kindness connects us all." People from all walks of life attended. Police officers in uniform, teachers from Sarah's school, local business owners, and families from throughout the neighborhood. Even the mayor made an appearance, presenting Sarah with a special Community Hero certificate that made her beam with pride. The highlight of the evening was when Sarah's classmates performed a special song they had written with their music teacher about kindness and sharing. Sarah stood in the front row, singing her heart out, while Jenny watched from the side, wiping happy tears from her eyes. Throughout the event, a simple display stood near the entrance, a peanut butter and honey sandwich, cut into triangles with a honey smiley face, next to a photo of Sarah and Michael on the park bench, taken by Mrs. Chen on that fateful day. Below it, a sign read, "Sometimes the biggest changes start with just half a sandwich." The fundraiser exceeded everyone's expectations. Not only did they raise enough money to help Michael with his medical bills, but there was also enough to start a community fund for others in need. Jenny was presented with a check to help with Sarah's education, despite her protests that they hadn't done it for any reward. As the evening wound down, Captain Rodriguez addressed the crowd. "Today we're not just helping one former officer or celebrating one little girl's kindness. We're reminding ourselves that we're all connected and that even the smallest act of sharing can bring out the best in all of us." The sunrise painted the windows of the Hope Valley Recovery Center in soft golden hues as Michael Cooper sat in the garden, watching early morning birds hop between the feeders. 6 weeks had passed since the day a little girl shared her sandwich with him, and each day brought small but significant steps toward healing. The center, a peaceful place on the outskirts of town, had become Michael's temporary home. His old colleagues had helped him enroll in their police officer wellness program, which provided both housing and counseling. His room was simple but comfortable, with a window overlooking the garden, where he now spent many of his mornings. "Good morning, Michael," called Dr. Sarah Williams, his counselor, as she approached with 2 cups of steaming coffee. It hadn't escaped Michael's notice that she shared the same name as the little girl who had changed his life. "Ready for our morning chat?" Michael accepted the coffee with a small smile, something that was becoming more frequent these days. "You know what I realized this morning, Doc? Today marks exactly 1 year since Emma's passing." His voice was steady, though his eyes glistened. "But for the first time, I can say her name without feeling like I can't breathe." Dr. Williams nodded encouragingly. They had worked hard on this, learning to keep Emma's memory alive without being consumed by grief. Michael had begun sharing stories about Emma during group therapy sessions, helping others understand that it was okay to remember the joy while acknowledging the pain. "Yesterday, I finally opened the box of photos I brought with me," Michael continued, pulling out a worn envelope from his jacket pocket. "Found this one of Emma teaching her class. She's wearing the flowers I bought her from Mrs. Chen's shop." He showed the doctor a slightly creased photograph of a smiling woman surrounded by young students, a vase of bright daisies on her desk. The recovery wasn't just emotional. Michael had started taking care of himself physically too. He joined the center's morning yoga sessions, something that would have made Emma laugh with delight. His hands no longer trembled when he held his coffee cup, and he had regained some of the weight he'd lost during his months on the street. Captain Rodriguez visited regularly, bringing updates from the precinct, and more importantly, friendship without pressure. They would play chess in the garden, their games punctuated by comfortable silences and casual conversation about everything and nothing. The other residents at the center had taken to Michael as well. His police background and natural instinct to protect others made him a calming presence during difficult moments. When a young veteran had a particularly rough night, it was often Michael who could talk him through it, sharing his own journey from darkness to hope. 3 times a week, Michael attended financial counseling sessions. The community fundraiser had helped with Emma's medical bills, but learning to manage his finances again was an important part of his recovery. He was learning that accepting help didn't make him weak. It made him human. On his desk lay a growing collection of cards and letters. Some were from his former colleagues, others from community members who had read his story in the paper. But his favorite was a crayon drawing from Sarah, a bright yellow sun smiling down on 2 stick figures, sharing what was clearly meant to be a sandwich. "I think I'm ready to start volunteering," Michael told Dr. Williams, watching a chickadee land on the nearest feeder. "Maybe at the community center's after-school program. Emma always said kids have a way of healing hearts." Dr. Williams smiled warmly. "That's wonderful, Michael. And how do you feel about eventually returning to work with the police department?" Michael took a thoughtful sip of his coffee. "One step at a time, Doc. But for the first time since losing Emma, I can actually see a future again. And it all started because a little girl wasn't afraid to share her lunch with a stranger." As the morning sun rose higher, casting longer shadows across the garden, Michael felt a peace he hadn't known in months. He wasn't the same person he had been before losing Emma, but maybe that was okay. He was learning to be someone new, someone who could honor her memory by helping others, just as she had always done. 3 months had passed since that autumn day in Henderson Park, and spring was beginning to paint the world in fresh colors. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Thompsons' apartment, where the kitchen buzzed with unusual activity. Sarah sat at her usual spot at the table, but today she wasn't alone. Michael Cooper, now clean-shaven and wearing a crisp blue shirt, stood at the counter carefully preparing sandwiches. His hands moved with purpose as he spread peanut butter on fresh bread, then drizzled honey in perfect smiley faces, just the way Jenny had taught him. "Is this right?" he asked Sarah, showing her his handiwork. She giggled and nodded enthusiastically. Michael had been practicing his sandwich-making skills for this special occasion. Jenny watched from the doorway, still in her nursing scrubs after her night shift, her eyes soft with pride. In the past months, their lives had changed in ways she never could have imagined. The community fund had helped her enroll in a nursing advancement program, and Sarah's education fund was growing steadily. Michael had become a regular visitor to their home, bringing with him a gentle presence that filled an empty space they hadn't known was there. He would often stop by after his shifts at the community center, where he now ran a program teaching kids about safety and community service. "Time for the special ingredient," Sarah announced solemnly, standing on her tiptoes to reach the counter. "Love." She made a grand gesture of waving her hands over the sandwiches, something that had become their shared ritual. Today's sandwiches were for a special celebration at Sarah's school. Michael had been invited to speak to the students about community service, and Sarah would help him tell their story. The simple tale of a shared sandwich had become a powerful lesson about kindness and connection. "Don't forget the notes," Jenny reminded them, pulling out colorful paper and markers. They had started a tradition of including small messages with each sandwich they made. Today's note read, "When we share, we make the world a little brighter." As they worked, Michael shared news from the police department. He had started working part-time at the precinct's community outreach office, helping connect people in need with local resources. His experience had given him a unique perspective that made him especially good at his job. "You know," Michael said, carefully wrapping each sandwich in wax paper, "Emma would have loved this. She always said that the best classrooms are the ones where kids learn to be kind." His voice was steady now when he spoke of his wife, carrying warmth instead of pain. Sarah beamed at him. "Do you think she would have liked my smiley face sandwiches?" "She would have absolutely loved them," Michael assured her, ruffling her hair affectionately. "Just like she would have loved you." Jenny joined them at the counter, adding apple slices and cookies to their lunch bags. The morning light caught the silver badge pinned to Michael's shirt, not a police badge, but one that read "Community Hero," matching the one Sarah had received at the fundraiser. "Ready for our big presentation?" Michael asked Sarah, helping her pack the sandwiches into her Winnie the Pooh lunchbox, the same one that had carried the sandwich that changed their lives. "Ready," Sarah declared, straightening her school uniform. "We're going to tell them that sometimes the biggest love comes in sandwich-sized pieces." As they prepared to leave, Michael paused in the doorway, looking back at the kitchen where so much healing had happened. The room was filled with morning sunshine, the scent of fresh bread, and the warmth of unconditional love. Not just romantic love or family love, but the kind of love that builds communities and heals broken hearts. "You know what, Sarah?" Michael said softly as they walked down the hallway. "That day in the park, you didn't just share your sandwich. You shared hope. And hope, like love, grows bigger when we share it." Jenny watched them go, her heart full. Their story wasn't just about a sandwich or a lost police officer or even a little girl's kindness. It was about how the smallest act of sharing could ripple outward, touching lives and rebuilding connections that seemed forever lost. In their little kitchen, with its worn linoleum floor and sunny window, they had discovered that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about bread and honey, and hearts that are brave enough to share.